the Buddha taught two ways that you can actually practice mindfulness meditation. Two separate paths. One was based on the Anapanasati Sutta, and the other one is based on the Satipatthana Sutta. The path based on the Anapanasati Sutta is practicing mindfulness with a basis of deep concentration, which means you develop deep concentration first, practice mindfulness after you have mastered that concentration. The path based on the Satipatthana Sutta is using straight mindfulness first, building up concentration second. But it builds up a different type of concentration to the first path. And so this is what we'll be looking at today. Because if we don't understand that there are different types of concentration, and if we don't understand which path we're trying to practice, generally we tend to jump from one to the other. So had a number of retreats lately, and recently had one last weekend as well. And during interviews, the most common thing that I find is that people are flipping between those two paths all the time. And sometimes they're not even going on the mindfulness path, it's just the pure concentration path. So if we're going to go concentration first, we've got to understand how to use that concentration for mindfulness practice. So when the Buddha was first on his path trying to work out how to experience freedom, he actually did a lot of concentration practices to very deep levels. And concentration practices are fantastic, very blissful, pure states of mind. Very, very deep, very, very profound. The problem is when you come out of them, right, you get some residue from the meditation, but your habitual patterns are still the same. They'll weaken a bit because you have to let go a lot to go into deep states of concentration. But you still will be controlled by anger and anxiety and lust and all these sort of things. Everything still controls your life. Still running towards pleasure and running away from pain. And that's what he found. Hence you might see a lot of gurus or very developed meditators in very deep concentration, yet they're caught up in a lot of scandals. Why? Because the meditation practice itself doesn't actually overcome, right, those tendencies. What it does is concentration practice suppresses them temporarily. It suppresses them. I mentioned earlier that in the 7 factors of awakening, the first factor is mindfulness. Mindfulness needs to exist for both whether you're doing concentration or whether you're doing mindfulness practice. This is because without mindfulness, you cannot know what your object of meditation is. You can't even know that you are meditating. Mindfulness is knowing this is what I'm experiencing right now. This is where my attention is sitting. This is what my relationship to it is. Yeah, so you can see how mindfulness is a really big foundation. But this is where it gets interesting. The way you apply the second factor, the factor of investigation, will swing you off in 2 different directions. If we're doing mindfulness of breathing, if we watch the middle of the breath and watch the breaths as if the in-breath and out-breath is just one breath, just going steadily in and out, like we just did just before, without looking at it in detail, without investigating it, we'll start to build concentration. When you're building concentration, if you are distracted, you ignore the distraction. If you wander off to a thought, you ignore it. Come back to your object of meditation. If you hear a sound, you ignore it. Come back. Pain in your knee, ignore it. Mentally agitated, ignore it. Relax into it. Sleepy, ignore it. Put more effort into looking. Create more energy. You just turn your attention away from everything except your meditation object, because you want the mind to become enraptured with. You want that fourth factor to come up. You want your mind, your attention to stick to the meditation object. And there's lots of concentration practices. You'll have mantras, visualizations, right? Candle flame meditation, kasina, where you have discs of different colours, clay discs, and you look at it, stare at it till that image is stuck in your mind. With this concentration practice, what we need to do is we need to see permanence. We need our object not to change. We need to see permanence over time. Yeah? So you always want to have your object in your attention. And so all these different techniques, including breath meditation when you're developing this, are done till you get to the stage where you actually get a mental object and you take the mental object rather than a physical object. And the reason is that our experience of all physical objects is impermanent. All physical objects change. If we're watching the breath, really the breath is changing. The in-breath disappears, the out-breath disappears, the in-breath disappears. There's no permanence there. Yeah? Every sound disappears, every sensation that we experience disappears, every thought, everything disappears. So it's all changing all the time. So concentration practices are concerned with creating permanence or looking at the characteristic of permanence. So when you're doing breath meditation, you want to build up concentration. What you do is you ignore the beginning and the end of the breath. You ignore the gaps, the gap between the in-breath and the out-breath. You ignore that gap. You want to look at the middle of the breath and only perceive the middle of the breath until the breaths just become as one. Then as that develops, right, pleasure will start to come up. When you get enraptured, when your mind sticks with it, pleasure will start to come up. What you do is you expand and grow that pleasure, and eventually the breath will disappear, and that perception of the pleasure will actually become your object of meditation. And now you have a permanent object that your mind can actually absorb into. And so you'll find when you're doing concentration practice, you get to the stage where your breath disappears. Have you noticed that? If anyone's done it, it disappears. Because the breathing becomes too gross an object for concentration to build up on. So building concentration, right, we want to see permanence. We don't want to see change. Building concentration, we want the object to sustain over time. We ignore all distractions. So that's what we just did just before. And that's why you might use a counting method, so that you're not getting dragged off and distracted. If you're developing the path of concentration first, you can actually turn the path of concentration into a mindfulness practice. Once you've developed the concentration deep enough, and there's two levels that you'll take it to if you want to do mindfulness practice. The first one is to what's called access concentration. And that's why when I said the 7 factors, right? So mindfulness, investigation, effort or energy or persistence, and then there's rapture, tranquility, concentration, equanimity. That concentration is real concentration, where the mind is fully absorbed into that one object. When the breath disappears and you've just got the pleasure, you use that pleasure, right, as your object of meditation, and let it grow, grow, grow. Your mind will start to become very, very tranquil, very, very peaceful within that. When it's fully concentrated, a nimitta, a light will appear. It's not like normal lights that people say to me. It's not all these different coloured lights and that. That's just seeing. A nimitta is not seeing. It's all, you could say it's the purity of the mind itself. The mind is taken itself as an object. At this point here, you've got two choices. At excess concentration, you can then turn your attention, right, on the nimitta and look on the outside of it and start looking at impermanence. Start looking at change. If you do this, the nimitta will dissolve. Then you turn your attention on the mind itself, starting to look at the characteristics involved in that concentration. So you're using the power of the concentration to start observing change. Why are we observing change? Because mindfulness practice is the observation of change. Mindfulness practice is observing impermanence. It's observing those gaps in our attention. It's observing how our attention changes from here to here. Right? So concentration practice is concerned with observing permanence. Mindfulness practice is concerned with seeing anicca, impermanence, and I'll explain a little bit later why. So what you do is once you've built up that concentration, then you turn it and start looking at impermanence. Whatever factors you turn your attention, anything you turn your attention to with that level of concentration, right? If you start investigating it, it will dissolve, it will disappear. And so you'll start seeing change, anicca, very, very clearly. Professional meditators, right, based on the Anapanasati Sutta, develop it further. What they do is they look at the centre of the nimitta, develop it till it becomes everything, right? Grows till it's everything, and then they absorb into it. And that's where they go into what are called the jhanas, the mental absorptions. You cannot do mindfulness practice in jhanas. You have no control when you're in a jhana. When you go in, and you've got no control when you'll come out. It depends on how strongly you've let go before your mind absorbs into the jhana. If you take, what they do is they master the jhana up to equanimity, which is a mind that doesn't like or dislike, a mind that doesn't waver, it doesn't judge. It's not seeing things in terms of pleasant or unpleasant. They then come out of the jhana. When they come out of the jhana, it carries that equanimity and very, very powerful concentration with it. And then what they do, if they want to do mindfulness practice, they start looking at change, anicca. So anicca, dukkha, anatta. Anicca is the characteristic of change or impermanence. Dukkha is the pain that we experience, or the friction we experience from change. Yeah? And everybody knows that change is painful, isn't it? From change. And then anatta is not being able to find anyone who is actually controlling those change. You can't find yourself within that flow of change. When they come out at that level of equanimity, they're already at, when they start looking at these characteristics, they're already at the mature level of the mindfulness practice. The level of maturity, which is equanimity. If they keep looking at these three characteristics here, then finally their mind will let go of existence and turn towards nibbana. Right? So what they've done is, this is called the sukha path, the path of pleasure. And the reason is because they completely avoid the 5 hindrances. So 5 hindrances to meditation, right, are mental grasping onto sensual pleasure, right, mental aversion, yeah, mental restlessness, mental sluggishness or sleepiness, and doubt. The reason is concentrating on one object suppresses these hindrances and they get behind it, they get through it. So an analogy I'd like to give you, think about, since we're near the beach, think about being down the beach. You've got a really good surf day down there, lots of white water, lots of waves. Concentration practice is like hopping in and going through right? All the white water, all the waves, and getting out the back and sitting on your surfboard out the back. They're no longer getting thrown around all over the place. So that initial struggle that you have when you're doing the practice is like being in the white water. That's the 5 hindrances, right? So building up concentration suppresses them, and you'll start to notice over time when you're doing those practices, notice how your mind starts to settle down, because the concentration is saying to hold back these hindrances. It's suppressing it. Yeah? Okay. So that's the sukha path, the path of pleasure. There's another way of doing this practice, and that is just straight mindfulness. Generally in the traditional teachings, people build up a small amount of concentration first. A traditional method might be Mahasi method, where you're watching the rising and falling movement of the abdomen. You're building up concentration first to help suppress those hindrances. But you're not building up deep concentration. It's only a very shallow level of concentration. Right? In this practice of pure mindfulness practice, the concentration comes second, mindfulness first. Where the concentration practice, your priority is building up the concentration first, mindfulness second. The 5 hindrances to meditation in mindfulness practice, based on the Satipatthana Sutta, are your objects of meditation. So straight away you start looking at impermanence, anicca. Straight away when you're watching the breath, your attention is watching the beginning of the breath, moment it arises, moment it ends, the gap in between, moment it arises, moment it ends, gap in between. You start looking at the various elements within the breath, pulling it apart. If your attention is distracted to a thought, the experience of thinking itself becomes your object of meditation. When that thought dissolves, you come back to the breath. You suddenly go out to a sound. You place your attention squarely on the sound. Your relationship to that sound is your object of meditation. When you're no longer attracted to the sound, you come back to the breath. Pain in your knee draws your attention. You place your attention squarely in that pain. Break up the sensations. Your relationship to that pain, the mental aversion to it, is the object of meditation. As your mindfulness grows and you start breaking things up and looking at change, a different type of concentration will start to develop. This is called Khanika Samadhi. It's momentary concentration. It still builds up to the jhanic level, to the level of the jhanas, but it momentarily absorbs into objects. Zhum, 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 very, very deeply. At first shallow, but it builds up when you get the consistency of attention over time. When it builds up strong enough, you start seeing anicca, dukkha, anatta. Impermanence, right? The suffering based on the change or impermanence, or on clinging onto it, and also nobody controlling this change. This practice is like doing the practice in the white water, in the waves all the time, not swimming out the back. Once you understand this change and the pain of hanging on to the change, things that change, strong enough, your mind lets go. When it lets go, it experiences equanimity, and the mind becomes balanced, still, unjudging. It doesn't grasp onto anything anymore. In not grasping, we're at exactly the same level. See, we're at the same place all of a sudden. We're both at equanimity. In equanimity, dukkha doesn't exist. When the mind is equanimous, you have anicca, you have impermanence or change. And you have anatta, no abiding self, can't find yourself in this change, nobody's controlling this change. Yeah? The dukkha aspect disappears when equanimity arises, because your mind no longer clings on to things, it just observes and knows things. At this time, leading up to that, change is happening very quickly. When in equanimity, there's a very subtle pleasure and everything is effortless. When equanimity matures again, the mind lets go of existence, turns towards nirvana, or conditioned existence turns towards nirvana, and that has a strong impact on the mind, very strong. So one practice goes through the white water, one practice happens in the white water. So why wouldn't you want to do the sukha path, the concentration path to equanimity first? Well, you can. You could do it up to the jhanas if you want. If you want to shave your head, take some robes and be a professional meditator, you can do that. If you want to lock yourself away in a cave, sit continuously for 5 hours and meditate, say, let's be kind, let's say about 18 hours a day, then you can do it, no problem at all. For people in everyday life, not so practical, is it? The reason is, remember, you don't want distraction. When you go into jhana, jhana will persist for many, many hours. But you need to live this very pure, monastic sort of life to do it. It's very, very hard for us to live in our daily life. Because we're always coming in with the agitation and restlessness, aren't we? We're always coming in with the 5 hindrances. You can develop in everyday life meditation practice up to access concentration, where the mind is very still, the nimitta arises, the light. Yeah, you can practice to there, and then do the mindfulness practice. You can do that. And some people are more suited. If you find when you're watching your meditation object, you tend to concentrate very easily, your mind becomes still and calm and tranquil very quickly, then that's probably the path for you. Develop the concentration first, then start turning your attention on change. Yeah? So permanence first, change second. That's Anapanasati Sutta, based on that. The reason why I teach the Satipatthana Sutta more than the Anapanasati Sutta in these classes is because when you're building concentration practices, when you come out of the meditation, it's no longer developing. Because your object is permanence. You come into everyday life, everything is changing constantly. So generally what they do is when they're doing everyday life stuff, they kind of hold general mindfulness. Just general mindfulness. Just generally be aware of walking around and standing and eating and sleeping and what their mind is doing. But if you want to build a continuous practice, Satipatthana is better, because if your object is impermanence, if your object is change, it means when you come off the cushion, there's no difference. You can actually do Satipatthana practice. You can be mindful of your relationship to things and the changing nature of all your experience in everyday life. So you can do it every waking moment. And this is why the Buddha taught 2 different practices. So you can actually take that practice out, and this is what it's meant to do. We're doing training on the cushion, but training for what? Training for everyday life. And so then your everyday life, what do? You be aware of your desires, your longings, your wants, your thinking, your obsessions. Be aware of your pain, be aware of your pleasure. Be aware of everything. Whatever's arising in you, turn your attention on it, develop your mindfulness on it. Because the concentration in this practice is momentary concentration, as long as you're being moment to moment mindful of what you're experiencing, the concentration will develop up to equanimity level, even in everyday life. Because it's not about having conditions, it's not about having a quiet room, as you've noticed. It's about being aware of your relationship to those sounds, relationship to the temperature of the room, relationship to what I'm saying. It's your relationships that are your object of meditation. The 5 hindrances are your object of meditation. Can you see? So the concentration can be maintained and can be built, and the mindfulness grow in everyday life. And that's why that practice is a practice that's coming more into society today, rather than the concentration practice. Though a lot of people are still confused about the two practices. Can you see? So one of them, the Satipatthana practice, feels rougher because you're in the white water. But once you realise that that's okay, your job is just to watch yourself get tossed around, which you're getting done anyway, then it's all fine. And you'll find the concentration will start to develop in the mindfulness, and you'll start to separate from it, and then the white water's going around, but you're not being tossed around anymore. Yeah? You'll suddenly learn to surf the waves, as it were. It will start to happen. And the maturity of the practice happens just the same. Does that make sense? Fantastic. It's about time. That's good. Thank you so much. So what I'd like to do now, let's do a pure mindfulness practice, and you'll see the difference between the first practice. Now, when you get distracted, we'll be doing mindfulness of breathing. I want you to pay particular attention to the beginning and the end of the breath. Really pay attention to how one breath goes, next breath comes. When your attention wanders, turn your attention or your mindfulness on wherever it wanders. Be it a thought, be it a sound or whatever, and look at your relationship to that. To help you surf the waves, you can use mental labels. So when you're breathing, you can say in and out with each breath. If you wander off to thinking, you go thinking, thinking. Sound, hearing, hearing. If you like the sound, liking, liking. If you don't like it, disliking, disliking. Hating, hating, whatever it is. Nothing draws your attention, come back to the breath. In this way, distraction is your object of meditation, and in particular, the points of change between I'm watching the breath and suddenly I'm thinking this thought. What happened there? I never noticed my attention change. I'm thinking the thought, and then suddenly I realise that I've been off thinking. There was suddenly a change between I'm thinking and I have no idea what I'm doing. Suddenly I realise, I'm supposed to be meditating. What happened there? Why did you suddenly come out of the thought at that moment? Why did you suddenly realise and start being mindful at that moment, not one moment before, or not one moment later? Something's going on, isn't it? And we don't notice. So we're not looking at the middles, we're looking at these transitions in attention. And that's what builds up the wisdom. And mindfulness practice is a wisdom practice. Yeah? We get freedom through understanding rather than through suppressing. And this is why the Buddha did those both practices, but then he came across this other one that actually when you come out of the meditation, it carries through into your everyday life and becomes your life, not separate from the life. Okay. So let's give it a go. Close your eyes over lightly. I'd like you just to anchor your attention, your awareness in your body. Start to relax into your body. As you anchor your awareness and relax into your body, you'll start to notice your breathing as it comes in and as it goes out. Be aware of the beginning, the middle, and the end of each breath. When your attention wanders, be aware of where it's wandered. Be aware of thinking or hearing or restlessness or sleepiness. Don't fight your attention wandering. Know where your attention has wandered to. Now bring your awareness back into your body, being mindful of your body, keeping your attention anchored within your body. So anchor your awareness within your body and hold that mindfulness so you can take it out into everyday life. Start to be aware of any sounds around you. Hear them, but don't listen to them. And when you're ready, you can gently open your eyes, be aware of seeing. Be aware of being in the room. So when you're doing pure mindfulness practice, mindfulness first, concentration second, you can intentionally build up concentration first, but you don't have to master it up to the deeper levels to do that practice. You'll find a number of the traditional teachers emphasize exercises at the beginning of their practices designed to build up concentration, like anchoring your attention on the abdomen or feeling the body, touch points in the body or whatever. They're all designed to build up that initial concentration to make the practice easier, to suppress the hindrances to a certain degree. But as you can see, the two different practices have completely different feel, don't they? One of them's turning your attention away from reality, ignoring what's going on. And it's in that practice where you really need that solitude, because what you'll find, that very effort to keep turning your attention away, if you're in society like we are, makes it very, very hard. Even if you start the concentration, suddenly something will happen or draw you out. And this could even be that your attention wanders out to think, oh, I've got to do this. Oh, I've got to do that. You can't have that if you want to develop deep concentration. That's why professional meditators like monks and nuns have other people preparing the food for them. Right? They have their begging bowls, people put food in the bowl, they eat it, wash their bowl, and that's all they have to do. They don't have to worry about money. They can't handle money in Theravada tradition anyway. They're not allowed to carry food after midday, right? When the sun's high in the sky, no more food. So they're living life from one moment to the next. So they can actually focus on that. But in your everyday life, you haven't got that. You've got lots of things to handle, haven't you? When you're doing the pure mindfulness practice, when your object of meditation isn't permanence, it's actually change and impermanence, then when you're sitting there and your mind goes out, oh, I've got to do this, that's not breaking your meditation, that is part of your meditation, that is actually an object of meditation. Turning your attention on that longing, this is just so important, I've just got to do that, and just sitting with it and not moving and watching that. That's where your knowledge starts to increase. So the hindrance to meditation then are not the enemy of your meditation practice like they are in concentration practices. They're actually the content of your meditation practice. They are the whole of your meditation practice. Why does your attention move? What makes it move? And what does it feel like when it does move? Because we don't know this. What's so enchanting about thinking that we have to do it 24 hours a day?
It's hard to shut your mind down anyway.
Why do we like to feel pain? Why do we get so attached to negative states of mind that we can't let them go? Why do we love to torture ourselves? Why do we love to grieve? love to feel anxious and stressed. We say we don't, but we like to think about it a lot when we do. We like to talk about it a lot.
It becomes a habit.
Oh, it is. It's definitely a habitual pattern. But somehow we get this pleasure. It's almost if we torture ourselves enough, then things will be right. It's almost come this thinking of flogging ourselves of our sins, torturing ourselves, making ourselves pay. I don't know. I watch it inside myself. It's just really perverse. But this is what I want you to answer. And what I'm saying mightn't be true to you, but that's okay. I want you to see what's true to you within your own heart and your own relationships to things. That is the basis of the practice. And that's why it's got nothing to do with sitting on a cushion. Sitting on a cushion allows us to build up deeper concentration so we might be able to penetrate, see a little bit more deeply. And we're saying, devoting our time, I'm training mindfulness now. That's all I'm going to do. But sitting on the cushion is training for everyday life. We're learning to surf the seas of life through doing this training. This is not separate. We opened our eyes, the practice continues. We stand up, it continues. Put the chairs away, it continues. Interact with each other, it continues. Walk out that door, it doesn't stop. And so this is why this practice, right? The practice that's mindfulness first, concentration second, is more suited to lay people than concentration first, mindfulness second. So I hope that helped clarify it for you. Okay. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Looks like a lot of people have been caught up in Easter. They don't realise what's more important, do they? Rabbits laying chocolate eggs or mindfulness practice? Okay.